I'm making a video on Ignaz Semmelweis, who I think was an amazing doctor in the middle of the 1800s. So Ignaz Semmelweis was the person who finally discovered why thousands and thousands of women were dying in the 17th and 1800s across Europe from childbed fever. So childbed fever, as it was known back then, is when the uterus gets infected during childbirth. Today, it's called postpartum endometritis, and it's caused by bacteria that normally reside in the urogenital tract. What happens is that during delivery, these bacteria enter the uterus and cause an infection. The infection is usually mild, except rarely if it's caused by more aggressive bacteria that don't normally reside in the genital tract. In these cases, it can be very serious if it's not treated immediately. Today, this happens very rarely, but in the 17th and 1800s, the severe cases happened very often. So for some background, before the 1700s, childbed fever was only happening infrequently, like 1% of the time. And then in the 1700s, when hospitals began to spring up in the big cities in Europe, more and more women started to have deliveries there. And in the hospitals, the incidence of childbed fever spiked. It was 5%, 10%, sometimes 20%. But it was not only the incidence, it was the severity. When a woman had a childbed fever in the hospital, it was a lot more of a severe disease. So in the hospitals, when they got the disease, the woman would first get nausea, poor appetite, fever, abdominal pain, abdominal distension. Then the infection would spread, and most of the time the woman would die. And then in pathology, when they did the autopsy, they saw that in the abdomen there was abscesses in the belly. A lot of women would also get meningitis and abscesses over there as well. So childbed fever had a very high mortality, and it was killing a woman at the prime of her life. Not only that, a lot of times the newborn baby would get it, and the baby would die from it as well. We now know that childbed fever is caused by bacteria, but back then, before the germ theory was solidified in the 1880s, no one had any idea that bacteria or any microscopic organisms could be causing disease. Now, people had ideas that some diseases were contagious, like smallpox, plague, leprosy. They knew that proximity could bring on the disease. The microscope was invented in 1600s, and bacteria were identified, but again, no one had any idea that bacteria could be harmful. So people had a general idea that it was the air around the person that was transmitting these contagious diseases. As far as the causes of these diseases, if you went to med school back then, they would teach that the causes were so complex that a human could not understand it. They were due to forces of nature too powerful for humans to do anything about. So as far as childbed fever was concerned, clearly the women were not in close proximity to each other, and the midwives and the doctors were not getting the disease. So it was not considered a contagious disease like these other ones. So nobody had any idea how it was coming about or where it was coming from. Yeah, so in the late 1700s and 1800s across Europe, childbed fever started happening everywhere in communities and especially in the hospitals. And some doctors got suspicious when numbers started spiking up. They started looking at the patterns and they started to suspect that maybe the doctors or the midwives could be transmitting the disease from one woman to another. They didn't know how. It could be their clothes or could be the air around them, but they suspected it. So they encouraged the other doctors and the midwives to wash their hands, change their clothes, wash their instruments before seeing patients. This suggestion was completely rejected by the majority of people. In general, no doctor or midwife wanted to believe that they themselves or their colleagues could be a part of the problem and could be themselves hurting women. After all, everybody was just trying to help in good faith, and these few doctors, they couldn't explain how or why this was supposed to happen. Upon rejecting the suggestions and solutions of these few doctors, the entirety of the medical community may have preserved their medical education and perhaps their pride, but at the cost of continuing to be completely powerless in terms of being able to prevent childbed fever. So you may be wondering, there's this horrible disease that's happening in the hospital, so why keep sending people there to deliver if that's what's happening? So yeah, for thousands of years, people just delivered wherever at home, and there was an occasional problem here and there. And then in the 1700s, when midwives and obstetricians started to play a role, it just became common sense. Why not let the professional take care of it? This way they can deal with the occasional difficulty if it comes up. So the thing was, in the 1700s and 1800s, only the richest people could afford midwives and could afford to have delivery at home. The rest would have to go to the hospital. So except for the rich enough to afford a midwife, everybody else went to the hospital to have their delivery. And in the hospital, the doctors felt powerless to prevent childbed fever, so they had no choice but to accept it as a possible and sometimes frequent complication of childbirth. So now, the story that finally shed some clarity in the situation was the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. So Semmelweis was a doctor in the mid-1800s who worked in Vienna hospital. Now keep in mind that Vienna General Hospital was a very large hospital, a high-volume center. It was a very well-respected place to practice. And also, Vienna was considered to be a very modern city at the time. This was in 1846. The mortality rate for births in the Vienna General Hospital was 7%, whereas the mortality rate for home births in the community was about 1%. So Semmelweis was a young man. He was considered to be a very good student. He was very inquisitive. Initially, he was studying to be a lawyer, and he went to Vienna to become a lawyer. But his friend took him over to the medical school to see some classes, and Semmelweis was immediately drawn to it. He had to become a doctor. So he became a doctor. He liked a lot of aspects of medicine. He was interested in pathology, anatomy. He wanted to do general medicine, but he ended up getting his first job as an obstetrician in the Vienna General Hospital. So as soon as Semmelweis started, he was shocked and very troubled by the very high death rate that he saw in the hospital. Now this hospital was split up into two clinics. There was one clinic that was run only by the midwives, and there was one clinic that was run by the doctors and the medical students. So the death rate in the midwife clinic was about 2 to 3%. So it was a little bit worse than the death rate in the community for home births. Now the death rate in the doctor's clinic was about 10 to 15%. Some months it was up to 20, 30%. And the patients, when they came in, they would be randomly selected for each of the clinics. So half of the people went to the midwife clinic and half of the people went to the doctor's clinic. So Semmelweis saw the discrepancy in the death rates and just thought that it was wrong. He saw no good reason for this. After all, it was the same hospital, and he immediately committed himself to figuring it out. Now, everyone knew that there was a discrepancy in death rates between the clinics, but people just understood it as something that couldn't be helped. They had explanations to why childbed fever was happening to some people and not others, but none of these explanations made any sense to Semmelweis, and they didn't explain the discrepancy in death rates either. A common explanation was fear and stress, like the fear that women developed as soon as they were admitted to the doctor clinic, when they saw all these doctors and medical students around and they heard about the high death rate in the clinic. So people actually thought that the fear and stress somehow contributed. Other explanations were different diets, noise levels, and poor ventilation. But the main underlying cause why people thought childbed fever was happening was something called genius epidemicus. So that term genius epidemicus, it's basically like we talked about. It's the medical school explanation of those times for diseases that were incomprehensible. So yeah, people thought that childbed fever was due to forces of nature that were too powerful to overcome. So all the doctors were concerned, but they felt like they could do nothing about it. Semmelweis was completely different. He always questioned everything, and he was determined to figure it out and to do something about it. And in order to figure it out, he had a lot of work to do, as we shall now see. So, in all German countries, it was mandated that when a person died in the hospital, that their autopsy be done in the same hospital where they died. This was the only way for doctors to keep on learning, and also medical students learned in this way also. So Semmelweis took this to heart. Whenever anybody died of childbed fever, he was the first one dissecting, and he was the first one to teach medical students all the pathology, all the findings. And he also cared a lot about every other aspect of medicine, so he was very thorough in terms of documenting the symptoms, and he would end up teaching this, and he ended up learning as much about childbed fever as anyone out there. He then looked at the midwife clinic and the doctor's clinic, and he looked at all the factors that were being considered as possible causes for childbed fever. He looked at the seasons, the weather, the air quality, the noise level, whether the priest was present in the ward or not, the procedures that were being done on the women, and he determined that there was no difference between the midwife clinic and the doctor's clinic in any of these factors. Now, what he accomplished with all of this is that he proved to himself that all the other theories were definitely incorrect, although he still couldn't find the cause for childbed fever. This was very distressing to him and very stressful. He spent months there in the Vienna General Hospital seeing death after death after death, and this took a toll on him. Finally, in 1847, he was urged to take a vacation. So he went to Venice with a friend, and it was very refreshing to him. But when he came back, he found out that one of his good friends and mentors, Jakob Kolechka, had died after getting a cut from a scalpel while doing an autopsy on a woman who had died from childbed fever. Semmelweis was heartbroken. He then looked at the medical file and at the autopsy findings of his friend, and he saw that Kolechka had had many of the symptoms and almost identical autopsy findings as many of the women who had died from childbed fever in the hospital. And this all happened right after the cut on the finger. Kolechka got swelling of the arm, fever, abdominal inflammation, meningitis with abscesses. Semmelweis realized then it must have been the cut from the scalpel that led to his friend's illness and death. Not the small cut in the finger, but the contaminating particles from the cadaver that had been on the scalpel's edge. He also immediately realized that it must be the same particles from the cadavers that were killing the women in the hospital. Yeah, so the medical students and the doctors would do the autopsies. They would do them with bare hands, and no one even thought about washing their hands before going up to examine or deliver the women. So Semmelweis realized that they were infecting the women in this way, and then the contaminating particles would enter the blood via small injuries in the birth canal. The midwives had no reason to even enter the room where the autopsies were being done, so this explained how they were not infecting their patients, and also the lower death rate in their clinic. Semmelweis then started a regimen. He ordered that all doctors and students scrub their hands with chloride of lime before entering the rooms to examine the women. He chose chloride because it was known at the time that it would get rid of the smell of sewage. So yes, back then, people would go up to the rooms with the unwashed hands smelling of rotting cadaver and examine the women. If they had used soap and water, it would still not get rid of the smell. Semmelweis' goal was to get rid of the smell, and he figured that would get rid of the contaminating particles. So this chloride regimen led to a quick fall in mortality rate from childbed fever, from 18% to about 2.5% in the doctor's clinic. So now, the death rates in the midwife's clinic and the doctor's clinics were about the same. Not only that, a lot of babies stopped dying too. So Semmelweis succeeded in his quest to figure out what was going on and how to prevent it. But still, he was humble enough to realize that he himself had been the cause of the death of a lot of women in the Vienna General Hospital. Semmelweis, probably more than anybody else, was guilty of dissecting cadavers and then going on to examine women on a daily basis. It wasn't just smooth sailing. A couple of times the death rate spiked in the doctor's clinic despite the use of the chlorine regimen. Semmelweis figured out that it was the presence of patients with active infections in the wards that were the cause of the problem. One of these times, there was a woman with an infected cancer that was draining pus. So everyone who examined her would then spread the infection to the rest of the women on the ward, despite being clean after leaving the mortuary. So he added rules to his regimen to prevent the spread of an infection within the wards, and the death rate fell back down again. This also added to his theory that contaminating particles could not only come from cadavers, but also from active infections in the living as well. Incredibly, despite figuring out what was causing childbed fever and being so successful in decreasing the mortality rate, Semmelweis was not given much encouragement at all. His director, Johann Klein, who was an older doctor and a strong believer in old medical teachings like the genius epidemicus theory, gave him no credit at all, and he attributed the decreased incidence of childbed fever to other causes, like a recently improved ventilation system in the hospital. A few other doctors in the obstetrics department did not agree with Semmelweis, and they complained about the chlorine regimen that it was uncomfortable. But Semmelweis knew he was right, so he worked hard to enforce the regimen, but this only ended up making him more unpopular. He did have some good support at the Vienna hospital though, mainly from Karl Rokitansky, who was the director of pathology, and also from some younger doctors like Joseph Skoda and Fernandette Hebra. Skoda and Hebra would actually be the first to give addresses in Vienna in support of Semmelweis' theory, before Semmelweis himself. But despite this support that he had, there was political friction in the hospital. Klein, the director, felt threatened by the younger doctors in the hospital, and Semmelweis. So when Semmelweis' post as an assistant expired in 1849, Klein did not renew it. So Semmelweis was jobless in 1850, and that's when he finally addressed the public on his theory, 3 years after making his discovery. So why did he wait 3 years? Well, it was partly because he knew he was going to face backlash and he didn't want to risk his job opportunities. So he did a few lectures in front of his peers in Vienna, and he was said to have done a good job in the lectures. But as far as the impact of his message, well, it was very little. Except for a few open-minded doctors, some of whom had already worked with Semmelweis, no one believed the existence of these contaminating particles that he talked about, and he was blaming the disease on. You couldn't see them, and they couldn't believe that there was such a simple solution to such a big problem that had been around for such a long time. Doctors had no knowledge about microorganisms and how they behaved, and they were being asked to believe that something invisible could linger in the skin of the fingers and cause great harm. So basically, despite showing great decreases in childbed fever, Semmelweis had no way of really convincing them because he couldn't explain the actual culprit because it hadn't been discovered. The second part is, for a doctor to believe Semmelweis, they first had to admit that they themselves or their colleagues had been part of the problem too, and were probably responsible for the death of many women as well. It's hard for us to understand how ingrained the theories of disease were in those days, whether it was the cosmos or the atmosphere or something in the earth that led to a particular disease. And usually it was a combination of causes that led to a disease, not a specific direct one like Semmelweis was proposing. Semmelweis realized that he didn't have much support in Vienna, so he left and he took a job at St. Roca's Hospital in Budapest, where there was a high incidence of childbed fever. But there was no medical students there doing autopsies or examinations. So because of this, some people doubted whether Semmelweis would be able to figure it out. However, Semmelweis was already very good at finding the source of childbed fever. He quickly found out that this was happening because it was the surgeons that were doing the deliveries, and they were doing them after operating on people with infections. Also, the surgeons sometimes did autopsies before taking care of the women. When Semmelweis implemented his chloride regimen, this led to a rapid decrease in childbed fever. Semmelweis, though, always preferred a teaching job, so when there was an opening in the nearby University of Pest, he took it. When he got there, he instituted his chloride regimen as well. However, he faced a new challenge in that the management and the staff were especially resistant to buy into his theory. So in this hospital, they were using linens that reeked of decomposition. The laundry department was doing a terrible job, and the hospital administrator was repeatedly ignoring Semmelweis' concerns. So one day, Semmelweis gathered up a pile of supposedly clean linens and barged into the administrator's office. He threw the linens with horrible smell onto his desk, and the administrator quickly realized the gravity of the situation. This then led to rapid improvements in the laundry service and a decreased mortality rate. In another instance, Semmelweis had to have a few staff members fired because they repeatedly left linens soaked in bodily fluids instead of changing them for the benefit of the next patient. In the end, he succeeded in saving lives, but it cost him a lot of friends in this hospital. He was known to have angry outbursts against people that were sabotaging his regimen. He grew a reputation for being irritable and compulsive. Semmelweis continued to teach, and in 1857, at 38 years old, he married and started to have children. His first 2 children died as infants, but then he had 3 more children after that. From a professional standpoint, a lot of obstetricians continued to disagree with Semmelweis, and they published articles attacking his theory. His theory was mostly known in the German-speaking countries, but it was mostly rejected. A couple of doctors published articles saying that they had tried chloride washings, and they have found them to be ineffective. But as Semmelweis knew, chloride washings required effort, and they were easy to sabotage, especially if people weren't buying into them. Semmelweis did have some followers. His former students, colleagues, and a few other doctors continued to support him publicly. But they were the minority, and he was aware of this. So in 1860, he started lecturing again, and he decided to write his book on childbed fever, 13 years after his initial discovery. When Semmelweis published his book, he had high hopes. Unfortunately, his book was not successful. He was not a great writer, and again, he was facing an uphill battle in terms of what people believed at the time. So I read through the translation of his book, and at least today, with what we know now, it seemed like a perfectly good scientific evaluation of the problem. He made some really clear points. He has amazing reasoning abilities, and you can easily see he was ahead of his time. But unfortunately, back then, he was unable to persuade his readers. His book is criticized as being repetitive, disorganized, egotistical, and inconcise, because he devoted a section of his book to defend himself against those who opposed him. In this section, he is known not only for attacking his critics' viewpoints, but the person behind the viewpoint themselves. So, ad hominem attacks. I looked through this and you can tell that Semmelweis does show emotion in this particular section of the book, and he shows quite a bit of it. It's just too bad that with everything going on around him, he was not able to avoid that. It's also too bad he didn't think to shorten his book. In any case, his book was not well received at all, and for the most part, it was ignored. In spite of the failure of his book, Semmelweis continued to have a few loyal supporters across Europe, especially in Vienna, and his theory was actually supported in Russia. In England, his theory was viewed favorably, although the details of it were often misunderstood. But overall, the overwhelming lack of support started to affect him. The stress seemed to get to him, and he was becoming more and more irritable. Based on the comments that some of his colleagues made about him back then, some people today believe that he had bipolar disease, which was worsening. He wrote letters to many prominent obstetricians who continued to oppose him, criticizing them of continuing to harm women. But rather than persuading, these letters just inflamed the situation, and he was left with just a few peers who truly cared about him and his ideas. Semmelweis began to deteriorate in the early 1860s. He continued to work hard, but he was abusing alcohol. In 1865, he somehow injured his finger and developed an infection. The infection got worse, it spread to his body, and it worsened his mental status, to the point that he was declared insane by a few doctors who were not particularly supportive of him. He was committed to an insane asylum. There, the infection in his body continued to get worse and worse, and he died shortly afterwards, after having had symptoms and a disease that was very similar to the one that killed his friend Jakob Kolechka and the many women who had died from childbed fever. Shortly after Semmelweis' death, some of his critics started to come around slowly. It wasn't until 25 years later, though, after the breakthroughs by Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, and others, that the germ theory was solidified and Semmelweis was remembered. Once it was proven that bacteria were all around us and could cause horrible disease, everyone saw how easily this explained childbed fever, and everyone saw that Semmelweis had been correct. He was finally honored. Today, Semmelweis has a university named after him in Budapest. Despite the opposition that he faced, it's hard to deny the impact that he had. He wasn't able to stop all the unnecessary deaths from childbed fever, but he did save a lot of women, and his followers probably saved quite a few women themselves, though it's hard to tell the extent of this. Even before Semmelweis' death, a colleague of his who traveled widely, Joseph Dietl, noted that his practices were influencing doctors across Europe. Doctors were avoiding contact with cadavers and were using the chloride regimen, despite not admitting to this in public. So, in spite of all the opposition, Semmelweis may have influenced even more than we think while he was alive. And when the germ theory was finally solidified, a good part of Europe was already familiar with the message and the method to prevent childbed fever.